300,000. But that's not even the point, because what we do know for sure is many more would have died if that small group of Westerners had not stayed behind and set up that 2.5 square mile safe haven in the middle of Nanking. I realized this was a story with heroes as well as villains. The most fascinating of all, I think, was John Rabe. He was the head of the Safety Zone Committee. He was a German businessman and, ironically, a Nazi humanitarian.
He would go throughout the city wearing his swastika armband, and the Japanese actually respected the Germans more than the Americans because they had a relationship with Germany at the time. And often he would drive through the city or walk through the city, and he would try to stop atrocities that were in progress.
He gave refuge to over 600 Chinese in his own house, and for days would go sleepless, ever vigilant of the constant threat of marauding Japanese soldiers looking for women. He and the other Westerners would risk their lives to collect and bring in food to the 200,000 in the safety zone. He also constantly petitioned the Japanese embassy in Nanking to stop the raping and murdering. Consequently, the people of Nanking called him the living Buddha. Rabe returned to Germany in February 1938 after the worst of the massacre was over. And then he just vanished. I could never get his story out of my mind, so I decided to find out what happened to him.
Finally, she located John Rabe's granddaughter, Ursula Reinhardt, and then she wrote to her, and Reinhardt told her there's a diary, and then I was so excited, and I think I remember she called me immediately. You know, he said, I not only found John Rabe, and he had a diary.
I tracked down the descendants of John Rabe in Germany and learned that he had kept a 2,000-page diary of the massacre, a diary which on various occasions the family had actually considered tossing out because the contents were too painful for them to read.
Ursula told me that when he returned from Nanking, he went around Berlin giving a series of public lectures and even sent Adolf Hitler a detailed report about the slaughter. A few days later, the Gestapo showed up at his house, and Rabe was told to never talk about Nanking ever again. After the war, because of his Nazi party membership, the Allies would not give him a work permit. So to survive, he sold his treasured Chinese artifacts and all his possessions until his family was reduced to living off acorn soup.
A letter from Chinese people arrived and told him how they adored him, how he had saved Chinese people, and they gathered money and sent care parcels to John Rabe.
Unfortunately, by then, Rabe was a very sick man, and a few years later, in 1950, he died of a stroke.
It's really hard to discredit the Rabe diaries. His evidence is far too powerful, and he can't be discredited anyway. I mean, he is a third-party witness to what happened. He was there on the scene. So how do you deny his reports?
In December of 1937, Japanese troops invaded the city of Nanking, China. Now, after 60 years, the story of what took place there has been written about in a new book called The Rape of Nanking. It was written by Iris Chang, and we're pleased to have her here on this broadcast this evening.
Thank you.
First printing is about 2,500 copies. It turns out a lot of people, especially the Oriental, the Chinese, want to buy that books. And they just couldn't find the books in the bookstore.
Actually, the biggest help came from her community because they started talking to Basic Books. They said, this is outrageous.
And they're irises.
Iris came along when we almost lost hope to bring the massacre of Nanking to the attention of the world, particularly in the Western world. And I immediately offered to promote Iris' book in Canada, provided that I could buy 2,000 of the books.
This chapter of history is so important to every Chinese people's heart, especially starting from the 80s. The Japanese ultranationalists, they start to, deny this chapter of history or deny the atrocities. So they really feel that Iris is helping them to express their feelings, their thoughts, and their sense of injustice.
The 60th anniversary of the rape of Nanking, we organized a commemorative concert, and every seat was filled, and Iris was surprised at the turnout. They came to talk to Iris and also to discuss how to bring this knowledge to the rest of the world.
What happened when Iris's book came out was that so many other families like mine who had basically been suffering in silence like my father had, alone and isolated, saw that here was this book that declared how many hundreds of thousands of people had experienced it. It lent a humanity to what they had suffered.
The reviews started to pour in, and everybody saw this was a major book. A typical book tour lasts 2 weeks. A great book tour lasts 2 months. She did a book tour for over a year. It was unheard of. We kept extending it, extending it, extending it. That's how long the interest sustained itself. There's a much more important story here than just the horrible ways in which people were massacred.
I feel very fortunate that The Rape of Nanking did become a bestseller. I didn't want the story to just disappear. I didn't want all those thousands of people's lives to vanish into oblivion. That's why I wrote it. What really bothered me was that powerful forces out there in Japan wanted the story to go away. I just felt it was insulting to the victims, and I think that individuals have to fight to prevent these acts of genocide from happening and then being forgotten.
If you look at the title of her book, The Forgotten Holocaust, that's how people feel. It's a tremendous loss that was forgotten.
As you point out, there were more people killed in Nanking than in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, and yet we have amnesia about Nanking. Why?
Well, I think the Cold War is the main reason why we have this worldwide amnesia on the subject. After 1949, neither the People's Republic of China nor the Republic of China and Taiwan wanted to push the Japanese for reparations or an apology, because both of them, ironically, now needed Japan as an ally against each other, and they needed Japan's economic and political support. To this day, I think there is a reluctance on the part of both governments to broach the subject with Japan.
Well, I think that Iris's book stirred up a hornet's nest here. I think that people from the revisionist school who want to minimize or deny Japanese wartime excesses were provoked by it. There's a real range of opinion here. Nanjing has become a very important and powerful symbol of what Japan did to China. It ranges from total denial, it never happened, it's a pure fabrication of Chinese propagandists, to, yes, lots of bad things happen, but those sorts of things tend to happen in war, to what is often called the Massacre school, which are people who actually are doing excellent research about what went on in Nanjing and detailing the extent of the atrocities, particularly against non-combatants.
It was in the early 80s that Japanese right-wing nationalists started to lash out at those in the massacre school.
Some of those individuals in Japan, courageous individuals, have faced ostracism, death threats, and even assassination attempts. For example, a few years ago, the mayor of Nagasaki was shot in the chest merely for stating his belief that Emperor Hirohito
bore some responsibility for World War II.
Katsuichi Honda, a popular journalist and author, wrote detailed accounts of the atrocities, and because of death threats, has worn a wig and dark glasses in public ever since.
中国の旅というね、ルポを書いたわけですね。その記憶にある人たちで生き残っている人たち、それにひたすら聞き歩くことを一番重点を置いたわけですね。脅迫もあったし、それから会社にはもちろんだけど、私の自分の家にも来ましたよね。だから私が留守の間に家族に子供の幼稚園、子供が行ってるところまで、小学校まで行ったんだから、それでこれはちょっと危険だと思ってね、それから家を引っ越してしまって、以後はもう住所を公表しないことにした。
She received some very ugly hate mail. For that reason, she kept her address private. I never even had her private phone number. I emailed her on everything. I never had her address. She was concerned about safety, but she certainly wasn't going to stop.
And yet there are people in Japan, prominent businessmen, politicians, academics, so not just the lunatic fringe, who say that the whole thing is a lie, that the massacre never happened. It's incredible.
Nanjing, no ma'am. We did not commit any massacre there in 1937.
None?
That was fabricated, complete fabrication by the Chinese.
You don't think eyewitness testimonies, Japanese soldiers' diaries, and film footage, and international...
Oh, those film footages were made up by the National Chinese Propaganda Ministry.
Unfortunately, a mountain of evidence on the Nanking Massacre, including thousands of archival materials in 4 different languages, as well as photographic and motion picture evidence and widespread news coverage, has not deterred these Japanese extremists from dismissing it all as propaganda or forgeries.
We may have killed a few thousand, but certainly not in the order of 100,000, 200,000, or 300,000.
Nobody was out there with their calculator, click, 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 that many people died, oh, that many people were raped. I mean, nobody will ever know. So if the debate is always fixated on getting the right number, and you can't say anything until you get the right number,